I had ruled Dravenmore for 19 years without a queen, and the court had long ago stopped expecting one. They had not stopped hoping, exactly. Courtiers do not give up hope so long as there is political advantage to be arranged. But they had learned to keep that hope quiet, because I had no patience for the parade of introductions my council once organized with such enthusiasm. A duke's daughter from the southern reaches, a Luna's sister from the Kelvrath pack, a merchant lord's niece who spoke 4 languages and played the hall pipes beautifully and could not hold my wolf's attention for the length of a meal. I was not cruel to any of them. I simply felt nothing, and I had made a cold peace with that fact. Some kings ruled with a mate beside them. I ruled with 17 wolves, and a court that had learned to read my silences. Sorvin was the eldest of the 17, a great gray wolf the size of a draft horse, with one clouded eye and a scar along his left shoulder that no one still living had seen made. He had belonged to my grandfather's grandfather, carried by the bloodline through 4 generations, and he had not moved from his place by the western hearth in 11 years. He ate when food was brought to him. He acknowledged me with the slow blink of an animal who respects you but is not impressed. He had not risen for a single guest, dignitary, or proposed Luna in the 11 years I had known him. My court had accepted this the way they accepted winter, cold, inevitable, and not worth arguing with. I tell you about Sorvin first because everything that matters begins with him. She arrived at Riven Keep's lower gate on a gray morning in the 2nd week of deep winter, and my gate captain's report reached me before she did. A lone woman, no pack sigil, no wolf, no letter of introduction. She had given her name as Sable Voss, said she was looking for her brother, and asked politely to be received. The gate captain had asked her twice if she was sure she had the right keep, because lone wolfless women did not generally present themselves at the gates of the northern wolf throne without someone behind them. She had said she was quite sure, and would he please send word. I heard this report and set it aside for a moment, because I was in the middle of a territorial dispute that had required 3 hours of my morning and showed no sign of concluding. By the time I had finished and sent my arbiters to draft the agreement, she had been waiting in the lower vestibule for nearly 2 hours. I gave the order to bring her to the receiving hall, expecting to spend 10 minutes satisfying the hospitality codes and sending her on her way with a referral to the court's record keeper, who could search the trade route logs for her brother's name. I was not prepared for Sable Voss. She walked into my receiving hall in a traveling coat that had seen several hard winters, her dark hair pulled back from a face that was composed and watchful and entirely unimpressed by the hall's dimensions. She did not look around at the vaulted stone ceiling, or the wolf tapestries, or the banked fire in the great grate, all the things that made visiting dignitaries stop and measure the room against their expectations. She looked at me, assessed me with the directness of someone calculating exactly how much of her time this would take, and then she inclined her head, not a bow precisely, but an acknowledgement, one person to another, and said, "Thank you for seeing me. I won't take much of your time." 3 members of my court were present. I heard one of them inhale sharply at her tone. It was not disrespectful. It was simply not deferent, and in my court, those 2 things had become difficult to distinguish. "You're looking for your brother," I said. "Cale Voss. He was hired as a supply route surveyor 7 months ago by a trading company that operates through your territory. He sent letters through the 4th month, then nothing." She did not fill the silence after that with apologies or elaboration. She simply waited. "His name will be in the transit records," I said. "My record keeper will pull the relevant files. If he passed through Dravenmore's registered routes, we'll find the entry. I'd like to see the entries myself, if that's permitted." One of my courtiers, Lord Arvin, who had been with me for 12 years and felt this gave him certain latitudes, cleared his throat. "It's not generally the practice to open the transit records to foreign nationals without." "Lord Arvin," I said, and he stopped. I looked back at Sable Voss. "You may review the records, My record keeper will be at your disposal during business hours. I paused. Where have you come from? Veldram originally. More recently, everywhere he might have gone before here. She had been searching for months. I had not expected that, though I could not have said what I had expected. Something in her stillness made more sense now. It was not composure that came easily. It was composure that had been worn into the grain of her by weeks of doors that didn't open and trails that went cold. I'll arrange a room in the East Tower, I said. You have a week's residence under the hospitality codes. If the records yield anything, we'll speak again. Thank you. She held my gaze for a moment. Something moved in it that I couldn't name, not gratitude exactly, and not calculation. Something in between, as if she was deciding whether I was worth the full truth of what she was thinking. She decided, apparently, that the question could wait. She inclined her head again and followed the steward out. Lord Arvin turned to me the moment the doors closed. Wolfless, he said, as if delivering a verdict. So it appears. No pack, no sponsor, no title. I'm aware, Arvin. She spoke to you as if she had something she needed and was asking for it plainly, I said. I found it refreshing. He had no answer for that. I turned back to the territorial maps on my table and did not examine why the receiving hall felt slightly less cold than it had that morning. She spent the first day in the records room. I know this because I asked and was told. I was not making inquiries in any particular sense. The East Tower fell under the steward's oversight, and the steward reported to me, and I received his morning accounting as I always did. I noted that Sable Voss had arrived at the records room when it opened, eaten her midday meal there rather than returning to her room, and departed at the close of business with a list of names she had written in a small leather-covered journal she carried in her coat pocket. I noted this, and I did not note that I noted it, even internally, because I was 19 years into ruling alone and had become somewhat rigorous about not following thoughts that led nowhere useful. The second day, she went to the transit stables. This was the part that had not been expected. The transit stables sat below the main keep, carved into the cliff rock, and they served the supply wagons and pack runners who moved goods through Dravenmoor's northern passes. It was not a place visiting guests generally went. It was loud and cold and smelled strongly of wolf and horses and axle grease, and the men who worked there were not known for their warmth toward strangers. My stable master's name was Edric, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the temperament of old stone, slow to warm, solid when he did. He came to find me that evening, which he had done perhaps 3 times in the 8 years he had worked for me. The woman from the East Tower, he said. Yes. She came down to ask about a surveyor. Small fellow, she said, good with numbers, bad with horses. He paused. One of my younger lads remembered him. Said he'd come through in late spring with a survey crew, left his pack with us while they went up the north face, and then the boy didn't know. Never came back for the pack, is what he knew. I went still. Her brother left his pack here. Still in the 3rd storage locker. We logged the long-stay items, thought it was abandonment at the time, put it in the record and forgot it. Edric's brow was set in something that might have been discomfort. She asked to see it. I let her. What was in it? Personal effects, a survey notebook, a letter he'd started writing and never finished. Edric looked at me steadily. She read the letter and she didn't cry, just put it back, closed the pack, thanked my lad and left. He paused again. Thought you ought to know. Thank you, Edric. He nodded and left. I stood at my study window a long time after, watching the snow move across the frozen river below the cliff, thinking about a woman who had been searching for months and had just found the first real proof that something had gone wrong, and who had put it back in the locker and thanked the stable boy and walked back up the cliff stairs alone. My wolf, who had been sleeping along the wall behind me, lifted his head. On the 3rd morning, I saw her myself. I walked the wolf runs most mornings at first light, a habit from my father, who believed a king who knew his wolves would not be surprised by them. The runs descended through the rock below Riven Keep in a series of wide, connected tunnels that opened onto the cliff's lower face, where the pack could move freely across the slope in good weather or shelter in the deep rock in bad. In winter, they preferred the inner tunnels, warm from the rock and from each other, and the great older wolves kept to the back chambers where the stone held heat from the thermal vents below. I came around the corner of the wide inner passage and stopped. Sable Voss was crouched at the entrance to the second side chamber, and two of the pack's mid-rank females, Marit and her sister Teva, wolves who had been born in this keep, and who tolerated the handlers and occasional visiting pack wolves with the benign indifference of animals who knew their own territory, were sitting in front of her. Not at a distance, not in the posture of animals investigating something unfamiliar and deciding whether to be wary. They were sitting close enough that she could have touched either of them, and they were watching her face with an attention I could not immediately categorize. She was speaking to them, quietly, in a low, even tone that I couldn't quite hear from where I stood, the kind of voice you would use if you were not trying to calm something frightened, but simply talking because silence felt less honest. Marit leaned forward and pressed her broad head briefly against Sable's shoulder. Sable's hand came up slowly and rested between the wolf's ears. I had owned Marit since she was 6 weeks old. In 8 years she had pressed her head against 3 people, me, Edric, and my youngest cousin, who had hand-raised her from a pup through a distemper illness that should have killed her. That was the full and complete list of Marit's chosen people. I knew this with the certainty of a man who had made it his business to understand every wolf in his care. I stood very still for a moment, and then I turned and went back up the passage, because I had the strong sensation that I had walked into something that didn't yet have a name, and I needed to think before I tried to give it one. It was on the 4th morning that Sarvin moved. He had been in his place by the western hearth when I came through the hall after my council session, the great gray bulk of him like a piece of the stone itself, his clouded eye half closed, his breathing slow and even, normal, as expected. I had walked past him with the familiar settling of a man who is reassured by a thing being where he left it. 2 hours later, my head steward found me in the map room and said, in a voice that suggested he was not entirely sure how to report what he was reporting, "Sorvin is in the east corridor." I set down what I was holding. "He followed her out of the hall," the steward said. "When she came through after the midday meal, he got up and followed her. He's sitting outside the records room now." I went and looked, because some things need to be seen directly. Sorvin was sitting in the east corridor outside the records room with the patience of a very old animal who has decided to be somewhere and sees no reason to explain himself. He was not pacing. He was not agitated. He was simply there, in the way that mountains are somewhere, without apology or justification. Inside the records room, Sable Voss was cross-referencing trade ledgers, her journal open beside her, her pen moving in quick, precise notations. She had not summoned Sorvin. She had not done anything that should have moved him. He had simply gotten up and followed. I stood in the corridor for a long time. "Has she noticed him?" I asked my steward. "Yes, my lord. She looked out when he settled. Then she nodded at him and went back to the ledgers." I looked at Sorvin. He looked back at me with his clouded eye and the expression of an animal who is entirely comfortable with his decision and does not require my endorsement. I went back to the map room and sat in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a while. My wolf had been sitting in the doorway during all of this. He walked to my chair, lay down at my feet, and put his chin on my boot. It was a thing he had not done since I was a boy. Something was happening in my keep, and I was the last one in the building to understand it. I did not seek her out on the 4th evening. I should say plainly that I did not do it because I judged it correctly. It would have been awkward, and I was not yet sure what I was trying to say. She was a guest. She was here for her brother. The hospitality codes gave her a week, and nothing had changed about that. The fact that my eldest wolf had risen from his place by the fire and attached himself to her records room schedule was notable. It was notable, and I was holding it carefully, the way you hold a coal in a folded cloth, aware of the heat without yet being able to put it down. What I did instead was go to the records room myself, after hours, and pull the transit files for the North Face survey crew that had come through in late spring. Cale Voss was in the records. He had entered Dravenmore with a licensed survey crew, registered at the transit gate on the 14th day of late spring, and had not exited. The crew had exited, 4 men. She had 5 names on her entry record. The 5th, her brother, was not in the exit log. Something had gone wrong on the North Face, or in the days after. The survey crew had not reported a missing member, that was a failure that should not have happened, and I felt a slow, cold anger begin to settle in me as I went through the file with more care. The crew had registered Cale Voss as departing independently on their exit record, which was a notation typically used when a crew member left a job early by their own choice. It was a notation that required no follow-up. It had received none. Someone had written a careless entry or a convenient one, and a man had disappeared inside my territory, and no one had noticed, because no one had been looking. His sister had been looking for months. I sat with the file for a long time. Then I called for my chief investigator. The 5th day assembly was a formal session. The full court gathered in the great hall for the rendering of territorial judgments, the registration of new pack alliances, and the general business of a wolf kingdom in winter. It ran for 2 hours most times, sometimes longer, and I conducted it from the high seat at the north end of the hall with my counsel ranged below, and the court assembled in the broad tiered standings that lined both long walls. Sable Voss was not summoned to the assembly. She had no reason to attend. She had been in the records room when the hall began to fill, and the records room did not adjoin the great hall. She would have had no reason to know the session had begun. She came in partway through, somewhere between the 3rd and 4th items on the register, through the side door that connected the east corridor to the hall's southern end. She was not dressed for an assembly. She was in her working clothes still, the traveling coat, the journal in her pocket, and she stopped just inside the door when she registered the size of the gathered court, clearly having come through without realizing where the east corridor led out on this level. She assessed the room in a single sweep, found the exit protocols, and began to move quietly toward the far door to remove herself without disrupting the proceedings. The wolves moved first. It began with the 2 youngest small males who ranged the outer corridors and who had been lying in the recessed alcoves along the southern wall in the way pack wolves do during assembly, quiet and out of the way. They stood up. Then the mid-rank females along the eastern standing, Marit and Teva, and 3 others stood. Then the males from the north alcoves. Then the ancient gray wolf from his position beside the high seat, where he had been placed with a chair-sized cushion at the start of the session, because he had not settled at the hearth this morning, and no one had been sure where he wanted to be. One by one, without sound, without ceremony, without anything that could be attributed to training or signal or coincidence, 17 wolves rose to their feet in the great hall of Riven Keep and turned to face Sable Voss. The court, which had been in the middle of a registration dispute about Eastern grazing rights, went silent, not gradually, all at once, with the totality of a room full of people who have collectively seen something they do not have a category for. Sable had stopped near the far door. She was watching the wolves with the expression of a woman who is genuinely still, not frightened into stillness, not frozen, but waiting, the way you wait when something is happening that you did not cause and do not yet know the shape of. The wolves began to walk toward her. Not rushing, moving with the deliberate patience of animals following something they have already decided. The young males reached her first and sat, one on each side. The mid-rank females filed in behind them. Sorvin walked from the high seat across the full length of the hall floor, the sound of his great paws on the stone the only sound in the room, and settled behind all of them, the back of the formation, the last and the largest and the oldest, who had not moved from his hearth in 11 years. All 17 wolves sat behind Sable Voss, and not one of them was looking at me. I descended the steps of the high seat. My counsel moved aside. The court on the standings did not move at all. I could see them from the corner of my eye, motionless in their tiers, every face turned toward the center of the hall, the kind of stillness that settles over people when they understand they are watching something that will be told later, that is already becoming a story even as it happens. I walked across the floor and stopped in front of her. She was looking at me, not at the wolves, at me. Her expression had shifted into something that was not quite readable, the careful attention of someone who has lived long enough on uncertain ground to know that a thing being remarkable does not necessarily mean it is safe. "Do you know what just happened?" I asked. It was not the speech I would have prepared had I prepared a speech. But we were well past the kind of moment that prepares for speeches. "I think so," she said. Her voice was level. "I think they chose." "They did." I looked at her. My wolf, my own, the one who had slept at my feet and raised his head when I watched the snow from my study window, was sitting at my heel, and I could feel in the stillness of him the quality of an animal who has been trying for 5 days to tell me something, and is relieved that I have finally arrived at the right conclusion. Sorvin has not risen from that hearth in 11 years. "I know," she said. "He told me." I stared at her. "Not in words," she said, with a faint edge that might have been humor. But I understood. I stood in the silence of my gathered court and my 17 wolves and felt, with a strange and humbling clarity, that I was the last one in this hall to understand what was happening. The wolves had known for 5 days. Marit had known on the 3rd morning. Sorvin had known the moment she walked through the east corridor. The court, watching now with wide eyes and very still faces, had understood the moment the first wolf stood. I had been the one holding the coal in the cloth, waiting to give it a name. "You came here for your brother," I said. "Yes. I've been in the records. There are questions about his file that should not have gone unasked, and I've put my chief investigator on it. He's somewhere in the territory. There is no record of him leaving. I intend to find him." Something changed in her face. Not a crack. She was not a person who cracked easily. I had established this already, but a loosening, the very small release of a tension that has been held for so long the person holding it has forgotten it was there. "You believe he's alive?" The investigator believes so. A missing person case with no exit record in a territory like Dravenmore has explanations, and not all of them are the worst one. "We're looking." I paused. "I want to tell you something else." She waited. "You are my fated mate." I said it plainly because there was no other way to say it, and because the 17 wolves at her back had said it first, and I had no business softening what they had declared without hesitation. What these wolves have done, this is not a performance. They do not perform. This is the oldest law of the bond, and they have recognized it without instruction, and I am not able to stand in front of you and pretend otherwise. I looked at her steadily. "I also understand that you did not come here for that. You came for Kale. You don't know me. A week is not enough for knowing, and the bond doesn't change that, not without your willingness." She was quiet for a moment. The hall was very still. "What are you asking?" she said. "Nothing tonight. I'm telling you what the wolves have declared because you have the right to know it and because you've been honest with me, and it would be dishonest to say nothing." I met her eyes. "When Kale is found, when you have him back, and you have had time to breathe, I would like to ask you something, but not before." The hall did not breathe. Sable Voss looked at me for a long moment, the way she had looked at me in the receiving room on the first day, as if she was deciding how much of the truth she wanted to extend. Then she looked down at the great gray wolf sitting behind her, Sorvin, who had crossed an entire hall for the first time in 11 years, and back at me. "Find my brother," she said. "Yes." "Then ask." It took 6 days, not 7. My chief investigator was a man named Rath who had worked for me for a decade, and who had, in that time, developed a talent for finding things that had been mislabeled rather than truly lost. He found Cale Voss in a small settlement on the northern cliff road, alive, unhurt in any lasting way, stranded there since late spring when a rockfall had closed the pass he'd been surveying, and his crew, assuming he'd gone back the way they came, had reported him as departed without ever confirming it. He had spent 7 months in a village of 14 people who were too far from the nearest transit post to easily send word, running out of money slowly, and trying to find a way back to the main road. He was delivered to Riven Keep on a gray morning, thinner and significantly more bearded than the small leather portrait Sable carried in her journal, and she met him in the lower vestibule, and whatever happened between them I did not witness, because I had the sense to not be there. Edric told me afterward that the stable boy who'd been asked to carry the pack up from the 3rd locker came back without it, and that he'd heard, from the far end of the vestibule, the kind of quiet that sounds like relief. I gave them 2 days. I was aware that the court found this waiting period puzzling, given what they had watched in the Great Hall, but I had said I would not ask until she had him back and had had time to breathe, and I meant it. On the 3rd day, she came to find me herself. She walked into my study with Cale behind her, a smaller, sharper-featured version of the same watchfulness, who looked at me with the slightly combative expression of a younger brother who has been told something he is still deciding how to feel about. And she said, "You said you had a question." "I did." Cale Voss crossed his arms. "She says you're decent," he said. "That's a fairly measured endorsement from her. Usually means she's already decided something and wants to see if you'll ruin it." "Cale," she said. "I'm just reporting accurately." He looked at me. "Are you going to ask it or make a speech first?" I thought about the 17 wolves sitting in the great hall with the patience of animals who had already given their verdict, and the old gray wolf who had crossed the stone floor without hurrying, and Sable's face when I told her we were looking for her brother, the very small release of a thing long held. "No speech," I said. "I'd like you to stay, to know Dravenmore as it is, winter and work and the long business of a northern keep, not as a guest passing through. If at the end of that you want to go, I won't stop you, but I would like the chance." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, and if I have conditions." "Name them." "Cale stays as long as he wants, with a proper surveyor's contract and an exit record that isn't someone else's careless notation." "Done." I review my own access to the records room without having to apply through the steward. "Done." A pause, and if I decide at any point that I want to go home, that door stays open. "It was never closed," I said. "I told you so in the hall." She looked at me for a long moment with those watchful, assessing eyes. Then something shifted in her face, not softened exactly, but settled, the way something that has been held against uncertainty finally finds a surface it can rest on. "All right," she said. Cale Voss looked at me. "Decent," he said again, which I gathered was, from him, relatively high praise. Then he looked at his sister and something passed between them that was old and private and none of my business, and he unfolded his arms and said he was going to find the stables because he had heard there was a pack of wolves who might tolerate him. Sable watched him go, then she looked back at me. "He's going to get himself adopted by your wolves within a week," she said. "They have high standards." "You would think so," she said, "and then Sorvin happens." There was a warmth in it, dry and quietly amused, the humor of a woman who has spent months on certain ground and is beginning to feel, cautiously, what less certain ground might be. I felt something in my chest that had been braced for a long time ease, fractionally, in the way that a keep settles in spring when the worst of the winter weight is off the stone. He knew before I did, I said. They all did. Yes, I looked at her. I was the last one in the room. You were, she agreed, without cruelty. And then, because she was the kind of person who does not let honesty become unkind, she said, but you did get there. Sable Voss stayed through the spring. She did not stay quietly. She was not a quiet presence, exactly, in the way that a person with no noise is quiet. She was present in the way of someone who has decided to actually be somewhere, which is a different thing entirely. She learned the runs below the keep, and the wolves learned her, and Sorvin attached himself to her working hours with the serene authority of an animal who has made a permanent administrative decision and sees no need to revisit it. She found 2 more transit record anomalies in the filing system while she was reviewing her brother's file, and she brought them to me with the same precision she brought everything, and we spent 2 evenings at my study table going through them, and I began to understand that she was a person who noticed things, the kind of noticing that is not performance but simply how a particular mind is built. Cale did get himself adopted by the wolves within the week. He also turned out to be, as his sister had described, bad with horses, and this became an ongoing educational project for Edric that I gathered both of them found mutually infuriating and vaguely enjoyable. The question I had said I would ask came in the early spring, when the northern pass had begun to open, and the first supply runners were making their way through, and the keep smelled of cold water and new stone, the smell of Dravenmore waking up. We were walking the upper battlement, which was a place I went to think, and which Sable had started joining me at, not by invitation exactly, but by the mutual accommodation of 2 people who have discovered they can share a silence without filling it. I asked. She was quiet for long enough that I knew she was giving it the weight it deserved, which was exactly what I would have expected from her, and then she said yes. We were married in the keep's lower hall in late spring, a small ceremony my counsel and her brother and Edric and the wolves, who attended with the calm assurance of animals who had seen this coming since the 2nd day of winter and found the 6-month delay somewhat unnecessary. Sorvin sat at her left side. My wolf sat at my right. Between us, in the old bonding rite my grandfather had kept in the record book, we spoke the words. When the ceremony was done, Cale Voss shook my hand with the air of a man who has upgraded his preliminary assessment, and Edric produced a bottle of the good dark spirits from somewhere that no one had told me he possessed, and the wolves accepted the general mood of the room with their customary dignity. I stood in the warm hall of Riven Keep with my fated mate beside me, and thought about an old gray wolf getting to his feet for the first time in 11 years, crossing a stone floor without hurrying, and settling behind a woman who had come looking for her brother, asking nothing except to be allowed to look. He had known, they had all known. And I was grateful in the end that I had been the last one in the room, because it had given me 6 months of watching her move through the world with that particular quality of hers, the noticing, the honesty, the dry humor she aimed at me without cruelty, the way she had read her brother's unfinished letter and put it back in the pack, and thanked the stable boy and walked up the cliff stairs alone. It had given me time to understand that what I was fated to is not simply a mate, but a specific person, who would have been worth finding regardless of what any wolf decided. Sorvin knew that before I did. He is, in all things, a more perceptive judge than I am. I have learned to be grateful for that too.